thank you, Gil, for this somewhat hyperbolic introduction. I hope he hasn't raised your expectations too high, but I will make an effort to actually fulfill the program that is set out in the title of this lecture. But before I start, let me underline the fact that I'm really very, very happy and very honored to be here. Ever since I started studying Assyriology, this institute, the Oriental Institute, has, in my mind, been sort of the center, or not one of the center, in fact, the center of the discipline that I had chosen for my professional career. My teachers in various phases of their own career have been here for 1 or 2 years, or another one came back regularly to work on the Assyrian dictionary. So stories about the Oriental Institute were always told to us during classes, and in a way I have always identified my discipline very much with this place. So every time I'm here, it is something special for me, and having been given the honor to address you here at this occasion is even more relevant and moving for me. So I'm really very grateful for all of you who made it possible for me to be here today, and I just hope that what I will tell you today will, to some degree, repay the effort you have made for getting me here. So what I'm going to talk about is an issue that we're all familiar with. I'm talking about economic growth, the question what prompts economic growth, and how it can be sustained, how it can be lost as an economic trend. The question whether it is the product of contingent economic forces or whether state agency has a decisive role to play. These are questions we're all familiar with. I will try to set out a case study taken from antiquity where we can see some mechanisms in effect that we actually can recognize. Nevertheless, obviously, we are talking about an ancient economy, and there are very significant differences to our own economic world, which I will underline when we come to these points. On the right-hand side of this slide, you see some Anglo-Saxon economists and, whose work has been relevant for the theoretical framework of this paper. Malthus for demography, John Maynard Keynes for the basic mechanism I see at work in the Babylonian economy, and Douglas North for new institutional economics, which gives a very powerful theoretical framework for conceptualizing the phenomena we find in our data. And now I come to my data. I'm going to speak about Babylonia, so what is today southern Iraq, essentially in the 6th century BCE, so in the period of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which at its largest extension covered the area you see set out on this map in green. This Babylonian Empire came into being in the late 7th century, stepping in the footsteps of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. It was in its turn conquered by the rising Persian then empire in 539 BC. So part of my period is actually the Persian period. You will see to which degree the Persian conquest is relevant for the analysis of the economy of this period. I will not say very much about the nature of the sources. I would just point out that we are dealing here with one of the best documented periods in all of antiquity. This 6th century has left us tens of thousands of cuneiform documents, administrative documents, legal texts of various kinds, of which maybe 25,000 have been read, have been studied, and it is this body of material that is at the basis of what I'm going to tell you today. To introduce you to what I'm trying to do here, let me familiarize you with the concept of wheat wages. The advantage of the Neo-Babylonian documentation from the 6th century is that it allows us to make arguments based on quantification. As you all know, economists have a great interest in numbers, and unfortunately for antiquity, we have not that much data that allows quantification. The Neo-Babylonian period is an exception in that we actually can draw on these thousands of texts to build some rudimentary statistics. It's not a very elaborate statistical argument that I'm going to make, but numbers are at the heart of what I'm going to tell you about. Wheat wages. This is a concept developed by economic historians to make comparison of levels of prosperity, of living standards possible over long periods of time. Essentially, wheat wages are conceptualized as the quantity of wheat in liters that the average wage of a manual laborer can purchase. So in one day, you earn so and so much money in whichever denomination that will buy you a certain quantity of wheat, and this quantity of wheat can be compared over periods. Wheat is nothing else than a stand-in for food, for calories. We could also say so and so many calories. And you can see how comparing the quantity of food an average wage will buy can be useful for analyzing living standards in a pre-modern society where obviously a large part of the population is very close to subsistence levels and is mostly interested in having enough to eat every day. Here you have some numbers from the early modern period. You see numbers, if we take just Vienna as an example, which range from 18 liters down to 8 liters and to 5.7 liters. It's interesting to see that the later we get in this sample, the lower the wages are. And I will just remind you, if you look at 1775 and this wages of 5.7 liters, I will just remind you of the fact that the French Revolution, which started a few years after this, was to some degree a revolution carried by masses that were suffering from famine, essentially. So remember this range from 5 to 20 liters. We will now, oh yes, and I should point out for the data from America, 15.9 liters in Maryland. And just to show you that we are living in a completely different economic world, for Austria, I've calculated the wheat wage for 2003, 369 liters, for 2011, 277 liters. You see that the wheat wage in Austria has dropped by significantly in those 8 years. This is the financial crisis that has hit incomes. Obviously, the same kind of calculation could be done also for America. So now we move to antiquity. And you see here the wheat wages taken from different types of data for different phases of antiquity and different regions. This is, I'm basing myself here on work done by Walter Scheidel from Stanford for the later periods and the Mesopotamian data mine. You see that for the most part, wheat wages range around 5 to 7 liters. This is fairly standard, and it doesn't really matter whether you're in Imperial Rome or in Sumer, in Mesopotamia, at the end of the 3rd millennium. This is more or less what you get. However, there are a few phases in recorded history where these wheat wages, so the average wage a laborer will get, are significantly higher. And one of these phases is the period I'm talking about, where we get essentially wheat wages that are double of what we would expect in the long run. And another such phase is Athens in the 4th century. So just to give you a comparison. And my question here is, how come that in this period I'm talking about, we have so high wages, wages that can be taken to be proxy data for overall comparatively high living standard. So where does this prosperity come from? The structure of this talk is set out in this slide. I will give you a brief introduction to the Babylonian economy. I will speak about agriculture, labor, and money. Then I will speak about the role of the state in shaping the economy. I can tell you already now that, in my view, the role of the state is crucial in creating this prosperous phase. And finally, I will address the question of prosperity and inequality. This is another issue that is being discussed also in our times. It's a very important issue, I believe, and I want to show you here that we can also use ancient data to address such questions that interest us today in our own political lives. Here on this slide, you set out, you find set out the basic features of the Babylonian economy in the 6th century. This is a phase of Babylonian history in which the country experienced rapid demographic growth and at the same time increasing urbanization. So not only were more people living in the country, more people were living in cities or in large settlements. The agrarian base of the economy, we are obviously talking about the pre-modern economy, so the majority of the population is working in agriculture. The agrarian base of the economy is expanding, not only quantitatively, but also qualitatively. So agriculture becomes more intensive. We find specialization of cultivation and cash crop production, so production of staples specifically for the market. At the same time, we find an increasing use of silver money. This is not coined, but it still fulfills all the money functions we typically associate with genuine all-purpose money. So we find an increasing monetization of exchange. We find a degree of labor specialization. So the secondary sector of the economy becomes increasingly more complex. The secondary sector is largely situated in cities, as one would expect. We find a large importance of free wage labor, which is also something economic historians would not necessarily expect in Mesopotamia, all of which shows us that we're dealing with what I would call an Iron Age economy that in many aspects is structurally fundamentally different from the preceding economies of the Mesopotamian Bronze Age. The agrarian basis for these developments is to be found in the fact that the Babylonian agrarian economy is one of the rare cases of a two-crop agrarian economy. So they have two leading crops. They have dates and barley that have nearly equal importance for nutrition and the overall economy. This is as in early modern Ireland, where in addition to grain, the potato was cultivated and brought a completely different type of agrarian system into being. What is the point here? So I apologize for the fact that you have some statistics or figures set out here, but it's very simple. We know from anthropological data taken from Iraqi farmers in the 1940s and 1950s that in traditional nutrition in Iraq, essentially staples, cereals and dates can be used interchangeably. Together, they make up 2/3 to 3/4 of the food an Iraqi farmer will eat during a normal year. The point is important that the one can be substituted for the other. It may not be necessarily very healthy to eat large quantities of dates all the time. It will do things to your teeth, but nevertheless you can survive. For economic history, the important thing to know is, oops, does this laser pointer work? No. The important thing is, maybe I need to switch it on. Yeah. Do you see this red dot? The important thing to know is set out here. Arable farming is significantly less productive than date gardening. 1 man-day of labor in arable farming will produce up to 55,000 calories of food. 1 man-day of labor for date gardening can produce up to double this amount. So if you manage to organize your economy in such a way that you get significant numbers of farmers to switch from arable farming to date farming, you will essentially double the output of your agricultural sector, and thus, in a pre-modern society, you will nearly double the output of your entire economy. So this is very, very relevant. And we see exactly that happening in our period. I give you just one example. Here you see set out the estates of a temple situated in this city. All these little dots are estates. We will see how these estates develop over time. Here we are more or less at the beginning of our period. We see not all of these estates are active, so they are starting to build this canal, to dig this canal at this time. So all these estates that are later active do not exist in 600 BCE. You see a couple of red dots, grain farming, and few green dots, few date farming estates. Now we move on 50 years. Remember, they are digging this canal here. And lo and behold, 50 years later, we find these grain farming estates here. Obviously, if you start working on an estate, you will first begin with grain farming because date palms need some time to grow. So in the first phase, you will have just arable farming. But another 50 years later, all these estates here that were grain farming are now essentially specializing in date cultivation. And for this temple, we know that in this roughly 1 century, the temple doubled, or actually more than doubled, its agrarian output. So this is very, very significant. Because what we see here is a process that happened all over the place in Babylonia in this period. It's a period of peace, you can invest, and thus the agrarian output increases. And this output generates a huge surplus above subsistence needs, and this surplus is sold on the market. Yeah? So this is the basic mechanism that produces economic growth in Babylonia from within. Another aspect. This is southern Mesopotamia, so Babylonia. All these green dots are cities where the Neo-Babylonian kings undertook major building work, essentially all over the country, everywhere. They dug canals, they built walls, and in the cities they built temples and palaces. If we go to Babylon, we see the entire cityscape is being transformed in this period. They are building everywhere, especially in the capital. And they are building huge things. This is Nebuchadnezzar's palace. Yeah? The South Palace, the North Palace, not entirely excavated. Just to give you a comparison, for those of you who have been in Vienna, this is the Imperial Palace in Schönbrunn, same scale. Yeah? Schönbrunn is not small, for those of you who have been there. It's more or less the size of Versailles. Yeah? So this is a significant building, but the Nebuchadnezzar's palace is much, much larger. Yeah, it's of course a different type of palace institution, etc. I'm just giving you this comparison to let you understand the scale of what they're building in this period. And the question is, of course, who actually built all this, who paid for it, and economically speaking, what were the consequences of these massive building projects, which clearly involved a large part of the population, a large part of the economy. When when addressing this issue, we are now moving to these parts of the diagnostic features of the Babylonian economy. So we have to talk about monetization and about labor, or rather first I will talk about labor and afterwards I will talk about money. And you will see why money and labor are important for understanding the question or for answering the question I set out before showing you these building projects. What are the sources of labor we have in this period? Obviously, you can have forced labor. You can have serfs, you can have slaves, you can have deportees. The fact of the matter is that maybe contrary to what one would expect, forced labor is always scarce in this period. You don't have huge quantities, huge numbers of slaves that you can use for large-scale building work. And we have many, many explicit statements of this in the letters of the administrators, as in this case where one administrator writes to another saying that of his workload of 4,000 cubits to be dug, so a stretch of canal, only a quarter was done by conscripted labor. The rest, so 3/4, was in the hands of people who worked for money, free laborers. So serfs, then we get temporary workers, conscripted men who are called up for temporary labor service as a part of a duty, a labor duty owed to the state. These people are numerous. However, even here, free labor has a role to play, because normally people who are called up for service, if they can at all, they will hire someone else to do the labor. So if you can, you will pay someone else to go and dig the canal. And then again, free labor comes into it. Yeah. And all of this labor, this free hired labor, is being paid with silver. So you see here how monetization and labor is tied together. Sometimes it's doubted in the literature that there is such a thing as a labor market in Babylonia. In the 6th century, there certainly is. I'm just citing here another letter which gives a nice example. A weaver is writing to his superior, "Let my lord give me money to hire laborers. Men who are for hire are laying siege to my doorstep, so please do not let my work stand still for lack of funds to hire them." Yeah? So labor is available, you just need to have the money to pay these people. Now, how can we quantify the importance of the three types of labor? Free hired labor, slave or serfs labor, excuse me, or corvée labor. Again, we have one very informative dossier. This dossier concerns the canal I have already talked about, the canal along which we earlier saw these estates. The documentation for this canal comes from the temple of Ebabar in this city. This temple is responsible for the digging of the canal, but it's drawing on all sorts of resources for doing so. The canal is intended to link the two main rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris. Towards the end of the 6th century, they actually completed this canal, and it was in existence until the Sasanian period. It appears in the Talmud quite frequently as always as the with its name, the King's Canal. From the archives of this temple here, of the Ebabar temple in Sippar, we find a dossier of work of lists of workers, of rosters of workers, which look like this. So we get a heading: temple personnel, corvée workers, and hirelings working on the dam at Gilusho. So this is this construction they're doing. Then you get an itemized list of all of people of different status and different origin, and a summary. If one, usually these texts are broken or they are damaged, but still you can work with the numbers you find in these texts. And if you quantify the entire documentation that is available, you can come up with this very rough statistic. These are man days of labor that are documented in this series of workers lists, and we see that hired laborers are responsible for 2/3 of the total of labor documented in these lists. The other categories of workers, so conscripted forced labor and serfs, they make up just 1/3. So 2/3 of the labor on this project is done by hired labor, and this is probably typical rather than exceptional on when this can be shown when comparing the documentation for other large-scale building projects. So public building, and we have seen that there's really lots of public building going on, depends on hired laborers who were paid money wages. The organization of this was quite often in the hand of private entrepreneurs, people who obviously profit from what they're doing in this area of the economy. This means that these public building projects channel huge amounts of money into the economy, which then circulates within the economy. And at the same time, a very significant number of men is employed throughout the year or through large parts of the year over a series of years, even decades, in these building projects. We have some evidence that points towards people working sort of full-time throughout their entire working life on such projects. So we get really a kind of working class to some degree as a result of these large-scale labor projects. So we've been talking about wages, so we also have to talk about prices. We have seen how huge amounts of money get into circulation. I mentioned these agrarian surpluses that are sold on the market. How do these markets work? What do they tell us about the economy as such? We have, for the first time in Mesopotamian, or actually in recorded history, sufficiently rich data that allow the plotting of price developments over a significant number of years. We can make a sustained statistical argument about the nature of these prices. They are clearly exhibiting what economists call a random walk. That means they are unpredictable. Yeah? And the random walk, this is a statistical feature you can demonstrate using mathematical models, not terribly complicated models. This random walk is characteristic of prices that are set by supply and demand, which is what we expect, of course, but which has not always been accepted for the Mesopotamian economy. So here we can sort of mathematically prove the existence of a supply and demand mechanism. This is a corollary of what I've just said. There is a strong interrelation between prices for different commodities. This price development, and I will show you this in a second, allows us to identify several characteristic macroeconomic trends in the Babylonian economy that can be linked to other features of this economic system that we know about from non-quantifiable data. Here on this graph, I have plotted together several price series. What I did was artificially setting the price in the year 500 minus 560, so 559 BC. I've set these prices at 100. This is just an index, okay? And you see then for the different commodities how prices develop from this common point onwards. So you see that they're falling generally in the beginning of the century, and then they are rising slowly, and then they're rising ever more steeply until we get to the first decade of the 5th century when prices are falling again. And you see that, for instance, the grain price, which is this blue line here, rises up to 6-fold within sort of 50 years. Yeah? Whereas other prices rise only 4-fold or 3-fold or double. Yeah? So you see there is a significant change here, but or there are differences between various different commodities that can be need to be discussed and can be explained in part. But you also see that the overall price trend is very consistent for all these commodities. The first phase of our century is marked by falling prices. Falling prices because of increased supply. From the 550s onward, we see the effect of these large quantities of money that are being pumped into the economy. We increasingly get inflation and resultant price rise. However, this is not the only sort of factor that accounts for this very steep price rise later in the century. We know from anecdotal information that in the 540s and the 530s, there was a sequence of bad harvests, so supply shocks that drove up prices even more. So in addition to inflation, we get also a scarcity and thus even higher prices. And then we have the Persian conquest, 539, and increasing Persian taxation and a Persian interest in withdrawing staples from Babylonia, channeling these staples mostly into Iran. And this is then a demand shock, as economists would call it. So there's a significantly increase in demand, and this drives prices up even more. So especially the grain price here is reaching levels which have to be considered the levels of severe crisis towards the end of the 6th century. So here in this in this phase of our period, we can't talk about prosperity anymore. The really prosperous phase of the 6th century is from, say, 570 or 575 to maximum 545. So this is the benign phase. Afterwards, things get really problematic. Finally, at the end of the period I'm interested here, we see again falling prices to some degree because of deflation, I believe. Deflation because these large-scale building projects have stopped. Yeah, the Persian kings don't invest so much anymore in the Babylonian economy, they build elsewhere, and hence we have, relatively speaking, a decrease in money that is in circulation. Now, if one draws together the several threads of what I have been telling you here and adds some other features I, for reasons of time, can't discuss here in detail, it is possible to connect all of this by means of what I would call a commercialization model, which draws obviously in part quite strongly on aspects of economics which would have been very familiar to John Maynard Keynes. We begin with population growth, which is seen not just as a Malthusian challenge, but rather as a stimulus for development. We have a rising demand, obviously, because we have more people, but at the same time we have also an input of resources. These are the royal investments I talked about, which together generate positive feedback in the economy. We have, and we can, I could not discuss this in detail, we have this evidence for division of labor and specialization and a very highly developed entrepreneurial culture, all of which contributes to higher productivity, certainly in the agrarian sector. This is very clearly documented. Higher productivity that leads to economic growth. Economic growth that to a large degree is situated in the cities, which are a center of high consumption, but also of production, and which shape the agrarian hinterland through their consumption patterns, but also through their contribution to production. For all of this, this is a model that can be applied to other phases of economic history in other parts of the world. Obviously, for instance, for the later Middle Ages, the same kind of argument could be made. Now, I refer to the paradigm of new institutional economics here when talking about the agency of the state in all of this. My argument is that all of this would not have happened hadn't it been for significant involvement of the state, of the crown. Obviously, political stability, which is new in the 6th century, is the precondition for this economic development. You can't grow dates if every second year the Assyrians come and will cut down your date palms. So if you have peace, then you can do this kind of thing. If you don't have peace, then it's impossible. So stability, obviously something the state delivers. The state invested heavily in the agrarian infrastructure, which leads to extensive and intensive growth. On the interface between the institutional and the private sector, especially in the context of these building projects, we have a perfect setting for entrepreneurial activities, and we see that private fortunes are made in this sector. And we have seen these royal investments in these buildings, in these building sites in the cities, which pump enormous quantities of silver into the economy and thus contribute significantly to this economic boom. At the same time, this is one of the causes of the severe inflation we see later. So the state is crucial for all of what we have seen. And what Patricia Krone has called the capstone model for the pre-modern state, so a capstone that holds all things in place, but precludes change and development. This capstone model is clearly inappropriate for the role of the Babylonian state in this period. Now, if you have followed what I've said, you have perhaps noticed that there is an elephant in the room. There's something I haven't talked about, and this is the obvious question: where do the funds come from that the state invests that are so crucial for this development? Do we have resource? But the state has to get this stuff somewhere. Huh? So do we have mostly a model that is based on resource extraction in the imperial center. So do we have a tax and spend model? Or do these resources come from the imperial periphery? So do we have, as an alternative to tax and spend, a plunder, pillage, burn, and spend model? Yeah. Let's look to the imperial center. We know a lot about taxation in this period. We know that the state is mostly interested in labor and in military service, not so much in commodities or taxes paid in cash. There are some, but it's not crucial. We know that the state targeted those sectors of the economy that had some surplus at their disposal and that were easily reachable. So propertied urban households and temples. The idea was to invest minimum bureaucratic effort for maximum effect. This is the idea behind the Babylonian tax model. For the bulk of the population, especially the rural population, I don't believe that the power of the state very frequently reached down to the level of individual households. The reach of the state, even though it was a fairly efficient state for the standards of the time, the reach of the state was limited. And society at large was targeted in terms of taxation, if at all, mostly through indirect taxes on transactions, taxes on transport, such things. But direct taxation was not a major concern for the population at large, which means that the majority of a large part of the funds that are invested by the Babylonian crown in Babylonia must have come from elsewhere. So they must have come from the imperial periphery. And here I apologize to the Assyrians who have done much the same thing, but in contrast, the Babylonians have left us the pictorial representation of what they did in the provinces, or what they did to those who objected to their view of how politics should be run. The best evidence for the effects of Babylonian imperial rule can be found in Judah, so in the westernmost periphery of the empire, where large-scale surveys, archaeological surveys, have allowed us to recognize the presence of a massive reduction in population levels in the period of Babylonian occupation. And if we see figures like this, this is taken from a book by Oded Lipschitz. End of the Iron Age, estimated population in Judah, 108,000. After the Babylonians have left, 30,000. This must be linked to the agency of the Babylonian state. And this, I argue, is sort of the other side of the coin. This is the other side of the prosperity in the imperial center. So this is what imperial rule in Iron Age Mesopotamia is also about. Now, if I have still 10 minutes, is this possible? I come to my final point, which is inequality. Here I take my cue from a book that has been discussed a lot in recent years, Thomas Piketty, French economist, at the Capital in the 21st century. His argument is that economic growth, I'm simplifying, but this is what it comes down, what it boils down to. Economic growth is necessarily accompanied by growing inequality unless there are checks and balances that are put into the system by politics. Historically speaking, the most effective leveler of inequality is war, is violence. Otherwise, if economies are left to their own devices, this is Piketty's argument, and if economies grow, then inequality will grow in step. So my question is, can we do a kind of Pikettyan argument for Babylonia? Maybe. I'm comparing the Babylonian Iron Age with a period 1,000 years earlier with the Mesopotamian Bronze Age, the Middle Bronze Age. We can, for instance, do a very simple thing. We can compare dowry lists. Documents look very much the same, even though they're 1,000 years in between. But if you actually look at the stuff that is given with the brides to be taken into the new household, you see that the dowry lists in the Neo-Babylonian period are incomparably richer. They simply have more stuff. And since these texts come from the same sector of the economy, of society, these come from propertied urban households in both periods, we can argue that these Neo-Babylonian people are clearly richer than their old Babylonian predecessors, even though they have the same social niche in the society. And this, of course, ties in neatly with what I've shown you with these wheat wages. Wheat wages in the 6th century are close to double, not quite double, of what they are in the Middle Bronze Age in Mesopotamia. So those two data sets neatly corroborate each other. So we can consider it a given, or we consider it proved that the Neo-Babylonian society, at least the urban society, was richer than the Middle Bronze Age Old Babylonian society. What can we say about inequality? We can consider it a given that elites are always, so the top of the society, the small uppermost stratum, these people are always very, very rich. And then we must reckon with an existence at subsistence level for the bulk of the population. But we can make a more nuanced argument for these propertied urban classes, which are sort of, excuse me the generalization, upper middle class or some such thing. Yeah? What I propose to do, I'm not going into the technicalities, but briefly, I compare in terms of daily income in wheat over a year. One can figure out this income. I compare inheritance shares given to males in the Old Babylonian period. I compare these data to dowries from the Neo-Babylonian period. Why don't I compare, say, inheritance shares of males from the Old Babylonian period with inheritance shares from the Neo-Babylonian period? I would like to, but we just don't have sufficient data. So I have to compare dowries, so essentially inheritance shares given to women in the late period with inheritance shares given to sons in the early period. Clearly, we can assume that there is a correlation, a stable correlation between the size of these dowries, so the income you can generate from them, and the overall household wealth from which these dowries or inheritance shares are taken. If one quantifies these data, we see, we have a significant range here. So this is, again, these liters of wheat per day. Yeah? Neo-Babylonian, without outliers, 1 to 78, 79 liters. Old Babylonian, more or less 1 liter to 22 liters. Yeah? The median is 7.1 in the Old Babylonian period, 12 in the Neo-Babylonian period, higher in the Neo-Babylonian period. Note that these figures are pleasingly close to the mean wage, which means that there is a correlation here. Obviously, an inheritance share or a dowry is intended to keep someone alive, so it's expected that there will be a correlation between the value of dowry and the income of a worker. Yeah, and the information here is easier explained by looking at the graph. The blue, I scaled the available Old Babylonian data just from the lowest to the highest, and this is this blue line, and the green line is the available Neo-Babylonian data. And what you see here is that the Old Babylonian data does not scatter very widely. It's quite coherent, whereas the Old Babylonian data scatters much more widely. The Neo-Babylonian data scatters much more widely. And this is said here. So 40% are in a central 5 to 12 liter range for Old Babylonian, and only 26% of the Neo-Babylonian dowries are in this central range. So in other words, we see two things here. First, we see a confirmation of what we already know, that the late Babylonian period, the Neo-Babylonian period, was richer than the Old Babylonian period, because synchronically at the same time you would expect inheritance shares for males to be more valuable than dowries given to women. Here we see that the Neo-Babylonian dowries are more valuable than the inheritance shares of the Old Babylonian men. This is just the opposite of what you would expect in one period. And then, second point, we also see that these dowries scatter more widely, and this means that they are more unequal, essentially. And since I argue that these dowries are a proxy data for the overall household incomes, this means that Neo-Babylonian households have a more unequal division of property than Old Babylonian households. So they are richer, and at the same time they are more unequal, which is a very neat confirmation of the main argument made by Piketty. Of course, it will only take you so far, but I still find this a satisfactory result. And now I come to my final point. We have been talking about prosperity and a relatively high standard of living in this period. We should not forget that these quantitative data just show us one aspect of society. Here I show you another aspect. I will just read you this text, which is an interrogation protocol taken from a temple archive. This is a statement made by female temple serfs who work in a flour grinding sort of sweatshop. This is the most unpleasant work you can do in Mesopotamia, grinding flour with millstone. They make the following statement to temple officials. On the 22nd day of the month of Ayaru, the first day of Cambyses, king of Babylon, king of all the lands, Mitsatu, a female serf of Ishtar, of the goddess Ishtar of Uruk, took a lump of clay in our presence and beat a dog with it. We asked her, "Why are you beating the dog?" And she replied, "I would like to die together with it. Itishu lumut." The dog she beat died of the beating. End of text. It's astonishing, perhaps. What is this about? Essentially, I think this woman who is, you must remember, she's a serf, she is doing horrible work. She is probably badly fed, she is miserable. She expresses this misery by venting her feelings on the only being around that is possibly below her in the pecking order. It's this poor dog. She kills the dog. But at the same time, Itishu lumut, I would like to die together with it, she identifies with the animal. This is typical for Mesopotamia. If you want to insult someone, not only from Mesopotamia, but if you want to insult someone, you tell her or him, "You're a dog." Yeah? So this is a lowly animal. So in the end, she identifies with this animal. She feels like a dog, essentially, and expresses some kind of death wish. Yeah? Because she is horribly miserable. Why do the temple officials take note of this whole thing? Well, because wanting to die essentially is subversive. You're supposed to live and you are supposed to work. If you express your wish to die, you are disrupting the system, so they will take note of it. And in a nutshell, this text, I believe, shows you again gives you another insight into this society, into this economy. I've been speaking about prosperity, about comparatively booming society. Still, we have to remember this is a society where large numbers were incredibly miserable. I thank you.